Hi everyone, welcome to Foresight Institute's Neurotech group, where we discuss neurotechnologies in general, especially with a focus on BCI and possible whole brain emulation technologies as well. And today we're really excited to have Catalin Mitelut here discussing lo-fi approaches for uploading. So really excited to have you on. This is definitely an area of great interest to Foresight, including one that we talked quite a bit about and explored a bit at our whole brain emulation workshop in the past year. So I'm really excited to see what you're up to and how you're progressing in that field, in this very small niche field, one should say. Okay, I'm going to share a lot more info about you here in the chat. Take it away, and the stage is yours. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions. Welcome to our...
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It has been a while for us to get together. I'm happy that we finally made it to this before Christmas. So very briefly about me, I'm a postdoc. I work in Switzerland now. I also have a collaboration at NYU. And my background is in a bunch of fields, including physics and philosophy. I have graduate degrees in these fields, and I also worked in law for a long time. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been working primarily in neuroscience as a neuroscientist, and I'm very much interested in neuroscience of agency and the free will problem. The talk today will be specifically about my efforts for the last 4 years to try to build a very large behavior data set and try to model it. And that's where the tone of this talk comes from. I've broken down my talk into 3 sections. There's a brief introduction to systems and behavior neuroscience, and what I think whole brain emulation is, by the way, and you guys may disagree. I'd love to hear opposing views or critical views of the way I think about it. Then I'll speak briefly about the neuroscience of agency work I've been doing, which is primarily what I do, about the modeling of rodent behavior is a small subset of this, and it's my project with collaborators. And last but not least, I'll talk about, this is just 1 or 2 slides on this idea of the Turing test for agency, and maybe it's just a good way to transition to just some open discussions of what the heck do we need to, can we define a paradigm? What's the minimal required paradigms for developing these kinds of technologies and cloning, et cetera, et cetera. So the question at the center of my research is basically the free will question. And I've always been very much interested in causality of free will and consciousness, of course. I've tried to frame a lot of my research in neuroscience around this question. Is still very challenging to do. But the context, if you zoom completely out, I view that this is a very fundamental, important question in humanity. And I think that large revolutions in science have occurred by reconsidering or devaluing the importance of humans in the universe. And I have this, I call it a mandatory slide for how important I think solving or understanding free will or behavior causality is, as big as these moving from the geocentric to the heliocentric idea of the universe, from intelligent design to evolution, from intelligence requiring biology to machine can obviously exhibit intelligence, especially these days, to the question of whether conscious intention really causes behavior. Is consciousness itself a causal factor in action, or can we actually understand consciousness as the outcome of a whole bunch of preceding causes, et cetera? And can we model behavior sufficiently to see consciousness as just is another factor in this causal? And again, I was saying the cause, I really think it's a very important problem of the 21st century, especially as we continue to improve our models of human behaviors and try to solve the AI problem, of course. So I have a couple of slides here. I apologize, I don't really know my audience very well, so I try to give a little bit of overview of what I think is pretty obvious points, including when I'll talk about cloning. But I do want to just put the context of understanding causality in the bigger pictures. Essentially, everybody in the sciences and most people in humanity are very much interested in this, or some sense. So we can think about causality even at the very smallest of levels. We have these very beautiful theories now, the Standard Model. We can think about electron behavior as it jumps around in orbits, and we can think about causality there. And it's caused, what is it caused by forces and some weird things like vacuum interactions, which are so bizarre, but they're extremely powerful, these theories and these models that we have built of electron behavior. And the pop quiz is essentially, do we actually know enough to emulate? So if you want to start talking about whole brain emulation, you can talk about whole electron emulation, right? Do we know enough about electron behavior, for example, to emulate atomic interactions or this electron behavior? And the answer is, of course, for simple systems, quantum mechanics is extremely precise. It's the most verified theory probably in the whole of all of the sciences. When I was doing work, I don't tell you how long ago, but many years ago, in physics, we already getting 16 or 17 decimal places precision in spectroscopy. But our descriptions are stochastic and probabilistic, right? We don't say electron has free will, it just behaves in a certain way, and we have very precise boundaries on the electron. When we zoom out many orders of magnitude, we can look at other types of things or organisms or agents. This is a little white blood cell chasing a little bacteria, a little black thing jumping around. This very famous video from the 1950s, 60s. It's a petri dish. a little white blood cell is chasing this little bacteria around. And it looks like it's a little organism. It looks like it has intention, it has a bunch of things. But we actually understand a lot about the mechanisms. It's basically chemotaxis. And there's these sensors on the surface of this organism, and there's chemical gradients that kind of make the skeleton of the cytoskeleton of this organism protrude out, and makes it look like this beautiful little organism that's walking around. So do we know enough to emulate a neutrophil? And I think we do have a sufficiently deep understanding of these mechanisms, deep in the sense of, since we can actually ask a lot of questions and answer a whole bunch of mechanistic questions with substantial depth. Human behavior is orders and orders of magnitude, obviously more complex. We know that human behavior is driven by genetics. We have this genetic, just like other types of biological organisms. Development and culture dominate our behavior substantially. So much so that sociologists don't really think, and many historians don't really engage with the idea of free will life. And of course, philosophers and others, we think reasoning is very important to human behavior. Do we know enough to emulate a human? And I think this is where I'll leave off, but I think the answer is essentially that many fields, entire fields of science and humanities, are really dedicated to understanding, quantifying human behavior and health and a disease. Of course, I'll just mention briefly, sociologists think that society and structure is very important and dominates. Individuals have much freedom. Economists, of course, talk about rationality, biologists, etc. Robert Sapolsky has a recent book out called Determined. It's a fascinating read. I urge you to read it. But the mandatory outro of this slide is essentially that machine learning and large-scale data sets are really giving us increasingly good behavior models. So we can actually model behavior within some constraints. And the interesting thing is, again, I would not have expected it 20, 30 years ago that we may not need homologs of human brain anatomy or understand even mechanisms. It seems like our models, largely underpinned by neural networks, seem to do very well. So given the state of the art of how do we clone humans, right? What can we possibly do given that we have these different types of use of different types of organisms and agents in nature? And my next two slides, I think, are pretty obvious, but I'm just going to go to them pretty quickly. The option one, of course, is always cloning brains. I'm happy to talk about this, and this is cloning brains is not my expertise, but definitely recording from brains and understanding them, single neurons, and extracting single neurons and dynamics. That's what I do. So option one is, of course, bottom up, record neural activity while organisms engage in behavior, natural behaviors, hopefully not like these laboratory behaviors where somebody presses a button or a mouse presses a button 1,000 times to get some reward. And we want natural behaviors ultimately. So we can put a device on it, hopefully a non-invasive device on human, build a whole bunch of models, figure out which ones is great, and then emulate the human. It's really the most obvious way to clone humans. The advantage, of course, that we are no brains, and emulating, if you can capture all the brain activity while somebody's behaving, then you probably are closer to generate a similar behaving organism, hopefully. The scary stuff, there's a bunch of stuff here that it's not clear. We get, are the clones going to be conscious? Will they be suffering? I think for any type of cloning, this is a problem or a question that's not resolved. Will we trivialize human life? And from my perspective, I'm very much concerned about machine learning and artificial intelligence and the alignment problem from the perspective of agency. Are we going to be, by collecting this data, are we going to create even higher risks for human manipulation and extinction? The practical challenge of doing this bottom-up cloning is technically prohibitive. For now, not clear. Some neuroscientists think that we'll never be able to incorporate all the neurons. I'm agnostic. I think it may be possible. Neuroscience of behavior is still in its infancy, so we don't really know. In this Agency Foundation paper I wrote this year with Peter Van Vliet and Benjamin Smith, I have this little plot, which basically, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in any case, the first, from the 1950s to about 2010, we were increasing the number of neurons that we can record simultaneously. So the human brain has whatever, around 100 billion neurons or so. And we were recording maybe in the middle 10s, something like the 2005, 2010, we were recording about 100 neurons at once. And since then, there's been a lot of technology, a lot of investments into neural recording devices. And we can now record probably a few thousand neurons simultaneously. And there's some papers out there that claim in the hundreds of thousands or millions, but they're very low resolution and they're using models, etc. To get the human level of recording 100 billion or even 20 billion neurons, we're still far off. I do want to point out this gray shaded area is that essentially all of neuroscience, all of especially computational systems and theoretical neuroscience, all of our findings, or the substantial bulk of them, come just from that band, meaning that we needed just 100 neurons to understand a lot about the brain. So we may not need even 1% of the human cortex in order to do our work. So maybe we already have enough neurons, or we will have enough neurons in the next 10 to 20 years to be able to really build neuron-accurate models. The cloning behavior is the other option, which is the top-down, record natural behaviors, build models, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Can we record this behavior, model it? Of course we can. Is it satisfactory? It's not clear. but there's substantial advantages. It's much easier to track organism. Machine learning, machine vision is improving quite fast, and it's not invasive. The challenge, of course, is that are we going to be satisfied with this? If we can really emulate an organism very well, are we going to be satisfied? What will be will the clone have an inner world? Would it experience the world? Is this what we want from cloning? The scary stuff, again, is will the clones or our descendants be soulless machines that just exist but not really experience anything? And option 3 for completeness is some kind of hybrid approach, which is what I'm trying to work on. It's this idea that you can actually fit your models not to neural activity, not to brain activity, and not to behavior activity, but to both. Maybe a coarse grain neural data time series and behavior at the same time. So my next two slides are really, do we really need brains? What the heck are brains for? Given it's probably a broad audience, I just wanted to spend just 2 or 3 minutes just talking about what brains do, just a very rough and quick overview what brains appear to have evolved for. So what are brains good for? Why are we on plants? It seems like on very fast time scale, we need pretty fast information processing, decision making, and chemo osmosis, the types of things that types of processes that plants rely on for survival is just not fast enough. And we need brains to do a bunch of other things. It's not clear why we have consciousness and self-awareness. I think it appears to be appears to be important, but we're not really sure yet. An important point I want to make on this slide, which is that essentially our brains to us to phenomenal experience. The experience that we have of the world comes to us through something like an inferential process, probably a Bayesian inference process or something like this. So our sensory systems don't really have ground truth. They're not magic, right? Your eyes don't see they certainly don't see subatomic resolution, but they don't see things as they are. Use basically prior information and they mix it with incoming information and they give you a sense of what's most likely present in the environment, right? So this has been established for several decades now, basically, that essentially our sensory systems present to us the outputs of a Bayesian inference process or an optimal inference process. And agency systems, again, so that was sensory, what's out there. Agency systems do a much weirder computation. So I think very few people in the world are aware, but your brain at every moment and every time, even as I speak now, is doing a very weird computation, which is that the phenomenal experience has to determine whether that is caused by itself. So these words that you hear coming out of my mouth, your brain has to decide if that's your voice or somebody else's voice. And then also understand the cause of that voice or that event or that sensory experience and whether you have control over it. So there's agency systems that are also at the same time active, constantly active. And everything you do, all the actions, all the thoughts that you have, all the stream of consciousness you have, there's a computation in your brain that gets done, that needs to be done in order to evaluate who's thought or who's in control of these experiences. And to understand that probably is the easiest way is to say that in schizophrenia, this kind of continuous stream of ownership, what's called a locus of causality, is broken. Right? People that suffer from schizophrenia, they hear thoughts in their brain, but they no longer experience ownership over them. It feels to these to people who suffer from this disease like somebody else is causing it, right? Somebody is causing thought disorders. It's a very bizarre experience, even though it is their brain that's causing the flow of consciousness. I won't talk about psychological systems, but they've also evolved to predict a much longer time scale, whether our actions, so if I choose to eat something or go to school, do something, or whatever action I take on the long term, is that likely to lead to well-being? There's a whole bunch of really nice research on there, including Detchi and Ryan, which done great work to move us away from a Skinner kind of pure behaviorism over our understanding of psychology. So this slide was really what our brains do. They do a bunch of things to keep us alive, but they also really they make all kinds of computations to give us the output of an inference process. And is consciousness required for W? I think it's a mandatory slide. I'm going to spend very little time on this. We really haven't figured out consciousness, at least not at the neuroscience level. We don't really know the causal sufficient necessary conditions, the 3 main theories on consciousness. Again, there's this paper by Seth and Bain, and I think Booton et al. Published something this year as well, reviewing some of this and trying to link these theories to artificial intelligence, neural networks like language models. Everything is correlative here. Basically, all the main theories, they say consciousness is occurring when something else is also there. None of them claim that consciousness is caused by it. So we really don't know what causes consciousness. We're still quite far away, depending on who you ask. So implications and way forward, I think modern behavior psychology may support this idea of whole brain evolution without recording every neuron, and maybe without recording most neurons. I'm not sure where I stand on that, but psychological states may explain behavior better than physical analysis. Even if I have all the neurons in the brain, it's very difficult for me to build the forward model or a reductionist model And it's much easier to, if I can understand human psychology, again, this is, I hope it's all repetitive to some of you. If you can understand behavior at the psychological state level, you can build much simpler dynamical systems that can model it rather than relying on 100 million or whatever billion neurons to that. And understanding the core causes of behavior is not maybe possible, but really what we should be thinking about is inference processes. And so we can definitely build emulation. We can definitely try to emulate organisms, but at the same time, we need to keep thinking about inference. If our models of behavior or whole brain emulation models can also do inference, we probably are moving in the right direction. Maybe one day such models can also develop phenomenal experience. So I hope that wasn't too fast, and I hope a lot of that or some of that was familiar to all of you. I will talk now about a little bit about neuroscience of agency in free-behaving rodents. Actually, I work also on artificial intelligence systems. Next year, I have a fellowship to do agency neuroscience in language models. I'm happy to talk about that some other time. My neuroscience research, I do two types of research. I do neuroscience work, and I also do a little bit of, I should say a little bit. I do about a third of my work is on modeling behavior. So on the neuroscience side, I have done I've worked on a number of projects. One of them is to try to show that the precursors to behavior in mice look very similar to those in humans. So since the 1950s, there's a thing called readiness potential. Basically, when humans engage in voluntary action, their neural activity, so their brain signals, they build up for about half a second to a second to 2 seconds or so. So there's something that we can read out from the brain prior to voluntary action, prior to being aware of it, that we can record, which is quite phenomenal. And I'm very much interested, can you actually predict what somebody's going to do voluntarily before they do it, right? This is one of the holy grails of neuroscience and of the agency, neuroscience of agency. So I've simulated, or I've replicated a lot of the human findings in mice to try to validate that rodents are actually good enough to do this type of work. My most recent project is on brain-machine interfaces, where I get mice to try to volitionally activate single neurons in the brain. This year is a 2-photon microscope. These individual white dots are single neurons in the mouse brain. And I pick a couple of them and I say, hey, mouse, can you figure out which neurons I picked and can you activate them intentionally without moving, or you can move, but you have to try to figure out which of these 2 neurons, your 100 million neurons or so in the mouse brain, can you figure out which neurons I've selected and can you activate them? And in fact, mice can figure out that over time. So this software will eventually be trying to, not license it, sorry, but trying to improve it so that it can be used for open source in the next 6 months. And I do 2 other types of work. One is decoding future locations from behavior, and another one is disentangling. I'm looking at neural circuits in the mouse brain. So now I'm actually interested in very specialized areas of the brain that appear to be computing agency signals. Again, not the topic of my talk today, but I'm happy to talk about it another time. The project I want to talk about today is my work with Lisa Diaz and Dan Sainz at NYU, which is basically a project that's been going on for 4 years, where we try to rebuild these large cage enclosures. We don't really build them, but they're pretty simplistic. We built these behavior recording and auditory recording systems. So I'm going to talk about that now. So one of the questions I get sometimes is, why don't you work in humans? I'm not really interested in humans for a number of reasons. One of them is confounds. When you put humans in the lab, you are no longer working with voluntary action. I really am very interested in voluntary action, and I'm interested in rodents. And gerbils in particular, they're very complex social rodents. They're very curious. As you can see, this is a video I took at the Bronx Zoo in 2019, right before COVID. They're very cute and they're very social. And they go through, they pair bonds, the male and the adult female, they can form lifetime bonds to raise pups. And they social communicate through foot tapping and a bunch of other behaviors, which are quite interesting. So I think that rodents are, at least gerbils in particular, are pretty complex organism. And I'm very much interested in, I think it's a middle way between trying to model very simple systems like amoeba or C. elegans or fruit flies, and even mice, which are much more primitive, I would say, in many regards. And then humans or primates, which are very sophisticated, but they're very complicated to do recordings from. So I pick these organisms, I hope, to convince you that there's at least some value here to these social rodents. So the project started 4 years ago, as I said. The gerbils can live 2 to 4 years. We only recorded them for 2 weeks at a time, but we recorded them day and night, meaning we had basically something like 13 million time points per family. We picked these families of 6 animals. There was 2 adults, a male and a female, and then 3 pups. These are 3 pups here. They're eating. There's a little food hopper here. They're super cute, and they do all kinds of funny behaviors. They push each other, they play, etc. And anyways, we really enjoyed working with them. However, the state of machine vision was not great. When I started, I used tools that had claimed to be able to track these animals individually, but it was not possible. So I and Lisa and Dan spent about 2.5 years just working with Tamo Pereira, who's now faculty at Salk Institute, helping him improve his tool so that we can actually track these animals with some sense of unique identity. And on the left here, you see basically the centroids of one of the families over a course of a few minutes of recording. And on the right here is basically 2 million fold speed up of these animals behaving in the space. The precision of our tracking is around 90 to 95%. There's still some foundational problems, but overall we can track them sufficiently well, excuse me, to make a number of interesting, there goes my. I won't talk about behavior classification, but obviously we have tracks now. We want to be able to say something about behavior. So we built a bunch of heuristics. For those of you that do behavior classification, there's supervised and unsupervised methods. It's a whole world of options here. We're just beginning to explore these data sets. I'm actually looking for collaborators, and as I'll talk about in the next few slides, and my way to finishing up in this discussion. But there are a lot of other things we can do, but we just did some very basic analysis. Our main findings that are presented in our paper are that indeed both the age or the developmental stage of the animal, the sex, and the time of day, the circadian rhythm, play causal roles in behavior. Right? This is a very elementary thing. We were able to pin down with some substantial precision when gerbils, for example, you see this darker blue. I hope you can see my cursor, but the very bottom curve here represents the time relative to adults that pups spend in the water spout region. This is where they get water spout. Until about P22, P23, this is about 22 days after they're born. They're probably still drinking milk, but all of a sudden, about 2-3 days, they discover the water spout. There's this little water region where they can get water, and they become independent. We're able to track that with some pretty great precision. They also like to play a lot in the food hopper region, which is this light curve. In addition to that, we're also able to show that there's some sufficiently distinct differences between behaviors by sex. Red is female, blue is male. And these are we have a bioarchive preprint. I don't think I shared it, but I'm happy to share it after the talk. The remainder of my talk is really about my intent. It's a very early work on modeling this behavior. And I'm looking for collaborators. I am not an expert in these methods. I know a bit more about some than others, and I'm happy we have a couple of collaborators, but I'm also happy to talk to others about this. So I have 3 axes that I'm going to talk about. I would like to think about the modeling agents as physical systems. Can we even do something as simple as modeling the interbehavioral interval distribution? So imagine these gerbils are running around, and every time they stop and they start, we put a 1, right? So this is a transition from stationary to movement, right? Say there's some kind of complex computation that gets done in the brain of the gerbil. We simplify everything down to a 0 and a 1. If the gerbil has initiating movement, we put a 1 every time it goes from stationary to movement. Can we even model that? It's a very simple, highly dimensionally reduced problem. The other thing is, which is very interesting, as an AI safety point of view, can we even extract reward functions or policies of these organisms living in such an enclosed space from data, which is like the claim of a lot of, or I guess an outstanding question in AI safety. And last but not least is probably the most interesting, probably frontier question is can we build models? Can we fit neural networks to the behavior of the gerbils, and can we generate naturalistic looking behavior? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. On the modeling the statistics of the interbehavior intervals, this is a very fast slide just designed for one major takeaway, which is that we have these 6 plots are for our 6 animals, and the colors in each of these plots is essentially a development state. We have about 14 days that we're primarily interested in, from about P26 to P29. They're normalized grams. And each of these curves, which there's about 13 here, represents the distribution of inter-walk or inter-movement intervals. Okay, and they're plotted on a log scale. And what the takeaway here is very simple. We do a line fit at least to this part from about 5 seconds to about 50 seconds. And the slopes of those lines are quite similar across all animals. Our sense has been, from looking at the literature on the distribution and power laws describing self-organizing systems, is that there's some information here. I think the slope is incorrect here because I forgot to compute it based on non-normalized plot. So I need to fix that. But we were a little bit surprised to see that regardless of animal or regardless of developmental stage, that the slopes of these distributions seem to be quite similar. And that raises the question of whether the behavior of these organisms really is driven by very low-level stochastic processes that are probably in charge of driving behavior at very fundamental levels, and that the individual, but the microstructure of behavior at the second scale, the sub-second scale, does not dominate the overall behavioral, or at least these time series that we're looking at. And the time series probably are driven by some kind of homeostatic or energy function that is very preserved across animals. I hope that wasn't too wordy. We tried to fit some elementary functions to the empirical data, and we knew already it's going to be challenging. So blue here is the histogram of inter-behavior intervals. It looks something like this. And we tried a bunch of functions. This is a log plot. Blue here is the empirical one. No standard function comes close to this. And I tried to explore a little bit. This is about as far as I've gone here. Try to fit markup chains to this behavior, to these time series. And we don't seem to get things for free. I thought that somewhere along the way, if I use the second or third or fourth order markup model, again, just very briefly, what markup models do, they basically build transition probabilities between time steps. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but essentially, higher order models take much more time into consideration than longer memory models. For example, an order 1 model basically says, can you build a transition probability for the next time step? I should have probably I'm a slide explaining markup chains or markup models here. I hope this is not new to everyone attending, but if you only take a single second of memory into account, your general model or your markup model really fails substantially to reproduce the behavior of the animal. The behavior of the model of the animal is black, the model is blue. And only as you take more and more time history into consideration can you start to replicate the statistics that are observed in the real data. It's a bit cheating, really, because, of course, if you compute every single possibility, so if your order 24 model basically means that we've computed a gigantic lookup table of transition probabilities from every single possibility in the span of 24 seconds. But nonetheless, it seems like these are necessary in order to emulate the really long-term dependencies in the behavior. I've also done a little bit of information theory, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. It seems to capture some dependencies that we observe in the other type of behavior we look at. Inverse reinforcement learning, I have done a little bit of work on this a few months ago. This is the next major part of my research. So basically, we take behavior tracks and we basically try to do IRL on it. And here, the red arrows are essentially the optimal policy. If the gerbil finds itself in this little square, what is most likely to go? The colored blocks are the reward value of each of these blocks. The yellow and green ones here are because this is the nest. This is the area of the environment where the gerbils they spend a lot of time. So once they're there, they like to go into this. It's like a little attractor. But we have to deal with curse. I don't know how to deal with the curse of dimensionality. This IRL method that I applied to you was fit to a single animal's track. So we literally took out only one animal, even though that animal's behavior is probably driven by a number of other things. It's driven by location of other animals, circadianity. We know that circadian time of the day does matter for where the animals, how much the animals move, etc., development, etc. The dimensionality, if I was to take all these variables, I don't even know how I would do it, to be honest, even though we have probably tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of behavior samples to fit our data, but they sparsify our data so much and make it at some level computationally prohibitive. So you have to do some heuristics or some hacks where you can build an IRL model, maybe pairwise. If one gerbil's here, I'll build one model. So I can build 25 models of conditioning, basically, my models of a single animal's behavior on where one of the other animals was in this space. I hope that's not too confusing. The last bits, my last slide here with contents. Can we fit transformers to these time series? The answer is possibly. I've only done some very preliminary work here. Transformers seem to learn some dependencies in the behavior initiation time series, but they don't do so well. When I use the transformers to generate time series, they break down even worse. Again, this is far from the last word on this. I'm sure that I can do much better, but it was just something I worked on in the last few weeks, actually. I'm quite excited about trying to just fit recurrent neural networks to these interbehavior intervals. So my last slide is really on where is all this going, at least for the AI safety or for the more kind of long-term concern for human being. And one of the questions I think I have, and I think probably if I were going to attend in one of your meetings, I'm sure you've discussed this. How do we quantify success for whole brain emulation? And we already have some measures of success. We know in psychology and in behavior science and economics that indeed we can actually predict what people do and how well they do it. Sometimes they do things big. People can implement very optimal inference, and sometimes they fail in very predictable ways. The same with perception, as I mentioned. But natural behavior from home to home is very difficult to model. It's all about risk-taking and optimizing economic benefit, etc. So what is a real measure of success? I'm not completely sure. The Turing test for intelligence I think comes to mind. It came to mind to me when I wrote this opinion piece on agency foundations. Very briefly, for those of you who may not know about the Turing test for intelligence, essentially you have these three components. A is a machine or an AI system, B is a human, and then the C is tasked to evaluate the output of these two systems or agents. And if C can be fooled 30% of the time, then we pass some Turing. Of course, I'm told that basically Turing didn't come up with this number. Somebody else did along the way in the history of computer science, and it could be any number. And what I propose essentially conceptually, if we can just have something like this, can we predict the next decision or behavior in an agent with 30% precision or some number, we can call that a measure of success. And what does this mean for human free will as this goes up? I'm not quite sure. It's not clear to me. The question is if you can predict what somebody's going to do, an agent, a biological organism, 50% of the time, even 30 or 40%, it already starts to become weird and scary. It means that they're very predictable. And maybe the organism itself thinks that it's intentionally or causally selecting or choosing, but maybe it isn't, because you're now able to model behavior substantially. So my summary and conclusion, I hope is not too complicated to draw some inferences. I think tracking biological agent behaviors is possible and profitable. There's a lot of this happening already in the world, and it's pretty successful. I think tracking and recording single neurons with high resolution is improving. I can't tell you where this technology is going, even though very large corporations like IMEC in Belgium and others, they're building the next generation of single electrodes to record thousands and tens of thousands of neurons from human brains. Modeling biological agents in action, I think it's a test bed for agency neuroscience and agency science and whole brain emulation. I really like the possibilities it gives us. And yeah, anyways, it's a working paradigm we can definitely engage with. And the last is just a warning that there's a race essentially with a lot of organizations to build open source models and knowledge and tools for these types of things and develop standards and minimal requirements. I think is very much key. So that is the sum of my talk. There's many people involved in these projects. I'm sure I missed some of them. I'm happy to take a few questions or hear your opinions. They don't have to be questions. You can just tell me what you think. I'm always very engaged by this whole ecosystem of questions. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have a lot of questions already. Do you mind if we just hit them up after we
Sure. Should I? Okay.
I'll let people unmute. As Randall, you had a few. Do you want to just unmute and start with your highest priority one, and then we can go to Zen?
Can you hear me though?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. I'm always glad to see work that's been done on agency, which is something that I'm not personally an expert in, and I love watching and presentations about that. I had posted 3 questions, and I think I'll go with my last one first, okay, because it seems to be the one that I'm most trying to figure out what is the definition of lo-fi uploading. And after watching your presentation, the impression I'm getting here is that it is very similar or very close to what we might call the typical neuroscience comp neuromodeling approach of making a model to test a hypothesis, then go back to the experiment to make a prediction, and then go back to the experiment to make a test to see if the prediction was correct, etc. Doing that cycle, which I'm very familiar with from work in hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. And I'm wondering, where is the distinction here? When does doing this typical computational neuroscience work become work on lo-fi mind uploading?
Thank you so much for your question. I don't think I have an answer. My opinion is that it's a continuum. And I almost want to give you the cop-out question, which is the Feynman question. It's like the tool, the model that you build is as good as it is. It's almost like a tautology, right? So it's a continuum. And if your model or your clone or whatever you want to call it answers your question satisfyingly, then it's good enough for that purpose. But if you want to go deeper, you want a deeper model or deeper understanding of something, mechanisms, then you go deeper. I think the only thing I'll add is that I think that maybe I shouldn't put words. I expect that some neuroscientists will say that this will never be enough. Modeling behavior will never be enough to reverse engineer the complex idiosyncratic brain processes that have evolved over many millions of years. So I think even leaving the whole consciousness, internal life, etc., out of the mix, I think a lot of people a lot of neuroscientists probably say that the brain is just so complicated that let's say you have millisecond precision lifetime of an organism, take a mouse or something, and we probably could get there. A year at millisecond precision is doable. Is a single neuron spike is about a millisecond. So imagine we had tens of thousands of neurons from a mouse, but we had the behavior for even for millisecond precision. Probably a lot of people say we'll never view that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think for me, it's a question of what satisfies you. And then you get into the philosophical, psychological questions of, does your system have consciousness or experience, right? And now we're getting into a substantial unknown, right?
It does get close to where I was trying to go with the question, because yes, you're right. People will complain that observing behavior may be insufficient to make a good model of a system, mostly because of latent functions that are inside of the system in the connectome that you didn't happen to observe because you only got a limited recording. That's why one of my other questions was whether you've had a chance to speak with Professor Conrad Korting, because he's trying to do the uploading question for just a very tiny organism right now, just C. elegans. And he would say one of the things he would point out is that doing recording, even on that animal, just an activity recording, may never be enough to give you all the information that you need, because you, even over the lifetime of the organism, you may not be able to observe all of the functions that are implicitly there in that connectome or in that system that's available.
Yes, if I can add, the C. elegans question is still, people have been still working on C. elegans a lot. And even if you had the neural activity of a C. elegans, you still cannot predict with high absolute precision what this organism is going to do next, because we still don't have sufficient knowledge. Again, even if we had, and we do have single neuron activity counting, etc. I have not talked to Conrad Korting. I know there's a bunch of people that work in this broad field, and I know the WARM project. I know there's lots of people interested in modeling that organism. I know I think there's a similar fly project as well.
Okay, cool. We have a few more questions. Thank you, Randall. We have a few more questions, and next one up we had Zan. If you want to unmute, go for it.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I actually have two questions to ask. The first one is, I've heard of some of the things you mentioned, especially about the states of the organism as it occupies different locations in the cage. It was very interesting, and it reminded me of sort of Carl Friston's active inference theory, where there were different states that you could possibly occupy as an organism, and somehow map the different states that it could be in, and if you could preserve an overall homeostasis, then you have a model of the organism. I was wondering if is that sort of what you mean by, if we can model all the states of that organism nominally, that we can somehow actually get a markup chain, actually model what's going on entirely.
So what is a state here? Just a spatial location in space, yes, or something more specific?
Yeah, as an idea of as the behavior. The idea is that you can model something by all the spaces it occupies. There's a set of states.
Okay, sure.
I could occupy, but I see the part that I'm not sure is it doesn't tell you about what the actual experience of the organism is, because you could have, but there's a phenomenal and there's an absence conscious component to, for example, earlier you used a global workspace theory, in which consciousness could be explained in terms of it being a global phenomenon. I guess it's now accessible to everything in the organism. And there's also the idea that consciousness is something that you experience. And just because something is global or accessible doesn't mean it's being experienced by the organism, or just because something is experienced doesn't mean it's accessible. For instance, you could have, I don't know if the simulation of neurons has the same experience as biological neurons does, but I can't say that they might behave in the same way unless in certain circumstances, but I can't make a statement about that being necessarily a conscious experience. So when you make a statement about that, are you talking earlier, when you're talking about consciousness, what are you specifically talking about?
You're alluding to obviously the philosophical, the zombie problem, right? The ability to have agents or organisms that look and behave like us, but they don't have an inner world. I think that's what you're referring to a little bit, and which has been talking a lot about in philosophy of mind. You're asking me what I was referring to in terms of consciousness, or
just because you had a slide on it.
Had a slide only to say that we really don't have a lot of causal explanations or mechanisms for consciousness. My personal view, since I gave you the talk today, I think agency is really going to be the most probably approachable in the near term way to understand consciousness. Agency appears to be a capacity that's evolved to generate these kinds of inference processes where the organism understands, it needs to represent itself, right? So the idea of agency really is at least phenomenal agency. I am causing things in the world, right? It's very important. First, from learning to breathe to everything is very important. So when you see something in the world, if you see whatever lightning, you didn't cause that. If you see, if you see your arm move out to grab a glass of water, you caused that. So it's very important for us to have this sense of what we can control and what we can control in the world. And the best theories, by the way, agency neuroscience is extremely young. 20 years has been going on. One of the most foundational findings in agency neuroscience has been overturned in the last 5 years. So like we're almost back at zero for a lot of things. And there's like a bunch of fancy areas in the brain that line up when you feel like, I'm in control of something, a bunch of specialized areas which are very interesting. And I feel like that is a little bit more approachable than just like consciousness in general. Like the sense of self is almost like integral. If you read like Julia Tononi or anybody, they jump a little bit around. Foundational to all conscious experience is that they're mine. It's a self. So that has to be done somewhere. There's a computation that gets done somewhere to say that this thing is mine, or my experience is mine, or my experience is mine, but it's caused by something else. So this kind of appropriation kind of computation gets done. I don't really have a lot. I think that I've been working very hard on, I don't want to rant here, but I'm working hard for about 6-7 years to try to sell the idea that we can study agency and even consciousness in non-human animals. On the philosophers and the human neuroscience, they're not really into that so much, but I think it's just like perception was never studied in rodents, and decision-making was never studied, but now they are. And I think they are good models. We really have to use, I don't want to get too tangent from your original question, which is about conscious. I really don't know. I think that we need to take a broader approach, including non-human animal models, to investigate these questions.
So you do think that, very quickly, it's just you do think that by modeling sort of the behavior of these conscious systems, that is in itself also perceiving it in the same way? Do you think we could study consciousness? That's
a very interesting question. So the 10-second answer is that, as I mentioned, I'm doing a fellowship next year just to look at language models are starting to build DC circuits, which I obviously deep reinforcement learning models are built around this kind of sensory control loop, right? Where the sensory representation, there's a comparison done between, so deep reinforcement learning models by their very nature have these optimal control theory loops. Language models don't, but I think they are close to that. So if those circuits are there, then it'd be cool stuff to do. I can't speculate whether they're going to wake up one day and have some. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a few more general questions I think that I would love to ask, but if anyone else wants to chime in, raise your hand, and then I'll try to loop you in. I think in general, that was a really fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And I can't believe how many things you're doing that are like pretty related and also really related to AI safety. It must have been like a long time coming for you. And now that the AI safety field, I think, is starting to pay really attention to the neuroscience field in this way. So I'm really curious if you were looking at this lens from an AI safety perspective, rather than trying to do something that is with the highest confidence conscious, but like something that is really helpful for alignment. Where do you see your work like going in the next 2 to 5 years? Like if everything goes according to plan, like what could you be doing in the next year?
Honestly, so if money was no object, I would really just try to become a bridge between neuroscience and science and artificial intelligence community. That's probably what I would do. I would just give talks nonstop. But so the weird things happen. I'm really surprised nobody's asked me really AI safety questions today, because this is really very worrisome for me. So I've been working on this problem of free will for a while, and AI capabilities they were over here somewhere in the periphery, and then all of a sudden they came very close to my concerns, right? I'm very worried about the capacity of the ability to model human behavior and predict it and manipulate it. Really, that's the fundamental fear I have. That machine learning and our data sets are going to increasingly build more and more precise models of human behavior, where they're like, anyways, I don't know the limits are. That's one part of my research. I would like to figure out what the limits of behavior prediction really are. So that's the AI safety question for me. So people that worry about AI misalignment, I worry about things like intent, right? So I wrote this whole paper on intention manipulation, right? If you fit your language models to human satisfaction, right? So you do RLHF to death until the model looks like it's telling you the correct things and you feel in control. Actually, what you're actually optimizing for is intent satisfaction, and complex AI systems and machine learning and tools and neural networks. They will create, that's the way I wrote it, basically they'll figure out exactly the horizon, the event horizon of your knowledge, and they'll only be trained to that. And beyond that, it's not clear what happens. Misalignment can occur very, very quickly. Sorry, I wasn't sure if that.
Yeah, and so that's
We
what
talk a lot about this. Yes.
is that what you're hoping to focus also some of your time on in the next 2 to 5 years? Or, yeah, if you could tell us a little bit. I think at the beginning you alluded to one research area that you wanted to look more into. Is that, or what are you up to like in the next?
I'm primarily so I'm focusing now on actually the neuroscience of agency in artificial intelligence systems. I think that I don't want to sound cynical, but I think a lot of people that work on mechanistic interpretability, I'm starting to do a little bit of it in improving the truthfulness around language models and AI tools, are doing a lot of capabilities research. And to me, it's scary. It's pushing this frontier until to some point where maybe we will no longer understand how the language models fail us or how our tools fail us. So I'm trying to focus even more now on two specific questions. One of them is, do neural networks, if you will, or whatever you want to call them, that underpin language models and future artificial intelligence systems, will they develop circuits to optimize for Bayesian inference, right? So underneath all of this agency computation that I mentioned, they appear to be Bayesian inference systems that build priors, and they compare prior to input, et cetera, and there's some kind of computation and match being done. And that's specialized enough for my field to start trying to think about whether, as we train and improve our AI systems and whatever you want to call them, neural networks, are they starting to exhibit these types of circuits and these types of properties? Because then you're starting to get in some kind of homologue to what biological organisms have done here, right? If you think about predator-prey relationships, the predator has to model, the prey has to model the predator, and there's always whoever has the better Bayesian optimal inference process, or the better inference process, will survive, right? And neither can be dominate the other, right? And these kinds of dependent. But if you have an AI system that doesn't depend on humans, and it can do Bayesian inference for everything we care about much, much better than us, then where the heck are we going to be left in? Especially if we're not in a symbiotic relationship, right, with these. And I like to think, just the last thing that I think is obvious is that I like to think of AI systems as organisms, not as tools. I think it's important to increasingly think about them. Maybe that wasn't obvious, but it's pretty obvious from me looking out, from the biology person looking back out into the space, to think more and more of AI systems as organisms and think about the types of capacities and capabilities that we build as organisms in the world.
Yeah, I think that's obvious from the agency angle that you take.
Okay.
I think that's obvious. Very cool. There was also some really interesting agency discussions, even in like Cortical Labs' latest research, or even from Michael Levin. He also has written a little bit about like agency within xenobots and so forth. So I think like people are exploring agency much, much more now, that within different organisms that are like perhaps like not like standard humans or even. So maybe in the last 2 minutes or so, I'd love to know, is there like a call to action or something that you have like for the broader neuroscience or AI communities? You already said if you had more time, you would just be giving talks, just a gap. But are there specific problems that where you're like, oh God, if I only had a few postdocs like doing this specific thing, we could be making much more progress? Are there any, for new people entering the field, what are a few like exciting problems to solve? Perhaps a few of them you've already mentioned, but to the extent that there's new ones.
That's right. Yeah, I think so. There's a few small things, there's a few bigger things. I think really the organism and perspective, the organism lens on artificial intelligence is very important. I try to push as much as I can. I try to give as many talks to AI safety-minded people as I can to pull people closer to the biological sciences, or at least to the physical sciences. And I think that's very important to think about language models and AI systems, not just failing from gradient descent and having these kinds of really benign failure modes where they can destroy humanity because we didn't specify sufficiently, or we failed to, for other reasons, right? I'm not talking just about homogeneous drives. So I'm talking about very specific organism-like drives. I think that's one of the major things I would talk about to people. And yeah, I give talks. I've talked to a bunch of people. I even gave a talk to Tom Everett's group at DeepMind. He does causal models and causal inference, and I pushed hard on agency. He's working a bit more on agency now, I see. But there's still a huge gap between what other people do and what but anyways, I'm trying to constantly provide a slightly different perspective to people. I hope most of the time it's understandable and compelling enough to at least make people think a little bit differently.
Cool, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining. I found it very compelling. Are there any final words you want to say, or any ways in which people can get in touch with you? I already shared your website here in the chat earlier, but if there's anything else people should be knowing, now is your final chance to say it before we close out.
Yeah. And there's nothing specific. Generally, I'm looking for collaborators. So this paper that I presented, part of it, the second part of it was just some modeling. I need I'm looking for collaborators. I have a couple of people helping, but I'm happy to, if people want to reach out to tell me about their expertise. IRL in particular is very interesting to me, but anything from your own perspective that you think you can add to this, I'll be very happy to hear. We're probably going to try to do as much analysis on this as we can and push it out in a few months. I would love to have more people contributing, collaborating, etc. I'm also happy to just supervise 1 or 2 people working on this and just rotate to a more kind of passive role. So I'm always looking for people to work with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope it wasn't the last time that we
All
hear
right.
from you. Can't wait to
Okay.
you again for an update. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for your great questions.
Yes,
And I
thank
hope
you.
you have a wonderful rest of your day.